use from the equation to draw graphs? Amplitude, awesome. I heard starting point, and I heard period. Okay. So we have been practicing that amplitude, starting point, and period for a while, and those are the things we really use to construct the frame. So your homework last night was more of an exercise in constructing frames more than anything else. And think about how you get these three answers: amplitude, period, and starting point. So for amplitude, isn't that just the absolute value of your A? And period was 2 pi divided by B. And then for the starting point, we have C divided by B, because the B is responsible for horizontal stretch or shrink, so that could affect our horizontal shifting. And then D. And there's the 4 letters in the alphabet that are in the general equation, right? A, B, C, and D. So we would have like some y equals A. It could be sine or cosine of bx minus c plus d. If we're going from a picture to this general form equation with A, B, C, and D, then we need those values. And in the picture, we should be able to identify amplitude, identify starting point, and identify period, and sort of like deconstruct those things to find the values of A, B, C, and D. Now, I will put out one warning here at the very beginning, and it'll be like our second example that we experience this. You have to be careful with C over B if there's like horizontal shifting at play. And I'll talk about that in the example, but you really, in order to be able to use your starting point, you actually can't find C or B if you don't know either one, because you have 2 unknowns equal to something and you don't know what either unknown is. So you'll actually want to always do your work for B first in the period. If you know what B is for that particular graph, then that's no longer unknown, and you can do C over that value equals your C over B, and you'll be able to solve for C. So you have to be careful with that if there's horizontal shifting. If there's no horizontal shifting, we really don't have to worry about that too much. Okay, so here's our first example. If you want to draw the pictures so that you have an example in your notes, what I would probably do is draw just like a rough sketch of this. So it looks like that point on my y-axis is 0, 4. And then I would just draw the other points, at the midline, at the minimum. So this point right here is pi over 2, 0. And then we go to pi, -4. And then we're back at 3 pi, 2, 0, 3 pi over 2. And then we're at 2 pi, 4. Looks like I have a 5 pi over 2, comma 0. Just draw something like that. That would be the easiest way to get a picture of that. Now, this looks different than the ones that you're going to see on your homework assignment. On the homework assignment, only one period is shown to you. So it's very similar to what we put at the bottom of that blue sheet in our notes yesterday. It looks like it has a start and a stop point. But in my examples, I chose to draw the continuous sine and cosine functions, because we all know their domain is negative infinity to infinity, so they really continue on forever. And if you were really doing this outside of my worksheet, you could pick any part of that graph that you wanted to write the equation. So I'm going to ask this question. When you look at that graph, do you look at it like a sine graph or a cosine graph? Okay, I would guess most people are looking at it as a cosine graph because they're just going to start at that top point, 0, 4, right? Okay, so let's look at it from that perspective. Okay, this is the top point of the graph. And so if I follow it through one cycle, I have to get all the way back to that max point at 4. So So there's one cycle of the graph, right, before it starts to repeat itself. And then I sort of like to box this so I can see, like, this is the frame that I'm considering because we did all of our graphing in frames. So if you're thinking about our amplitude, period, and starting point, it's in the context of a frame. Okay. Be thoughtful here. What's your starting point? 0, 0. Remember, for a cosine graph, the starting point is not the starting point of the graph. We're talking about the starting point of the frame always. So when I do my starting point for this particular graph, if I were working in the other direction where I'd done C over B comma D and constructed a frame, it would have spit out that value in the middle on the left, which is 0, 0. Once you decide where the starting point of your frame is, then amplitude should be pretty apparent. What's the amplitude of this graph? 4, because it's counting up 4 and down 4 to build the frame. So our amplitude is 4. And if you look for that full cycle, where does it start, where does it stop, you should be able to then calculate its period. 2 pi on this one, right? Not hard at all because it starts at 0. So if it starts at 0, finding your period is going to be a very simple task, right? 0 to whatever value. So my period is 2 pi. Okay. So in a graph, if you see a picture, you should be able to decide those things. Where is the starting point of the frame, not the graph? Then what is the amplitude? Just count up and down from that starting point. And then period, when do I start to repeat myself again? Okay, how long does that take? So this one is actually, I think, easier than some of the others because if your starting point is at 0, 0, what do we know? C is 0 and D is 0. For C over B, right, this is C over B and this is D. Normally I need to know what B is to like figure out what they are. But the only way that thing ever equals 0, C over B, is if C is 0. So I now know C equals 0 and D equals 0. Because the amplitude is 4, and you guys told me you thought it was a cosine graph, is it a positive cosine or a negative cosine? It's a positive cosine. So therefore, it's a positive cosine graph with amplitude 4. The A value must be 4. If you notice that it's like the reflected graph, then you would always call A the negative version of that. And then if your period is 2 pi, remember you can calculate period by doing 2 pi divided by B. Well, what must be B? Yeah. B is equal to 1. Now, a lot of times you can just like think about it, like 2 pi divided by what is equal to 2 pi. If you're ever stuck, note that you can make this equal to 2 pi. And this is really like 2 pi over 1. And then if I cross multiplied, I'd get 2 pi b equals 2 pi. Well, divide both sides by 2 pi, and b is equal to 1. But on that one, that's like way more work than I need to do, right? You guys would just argue it must have been over 1. So now that I have all my values, A, B, C, and D, and you guys have identified this as a cosine graph, I can write the equation. I could say something y equals, or in this case I'm going to say f of x equals, and just put them in the right spots. A times cosine x, or sorry, A times cosine bx minus c plus d. Well, that's for cosine. It's going to be 1x minus 0, which is really just x, and then plus 0. I don't need to write that. So there's my equation. Okay. Anybody got any questions about what I did right there? Now, in reality, like Noah could look at this graph, and where most of us said, I see cosine. Noah could have said, I see a sine. I see a reflected sine. It starts at negative pi half 0, goes down, goes all the way to 5 pi halves. He would have found a different value for C and really just C because there's a horizontal shift. He would have found the same values for A, B, and D because that's not going to change the period, the amplitude, or the vertical shifting. So I'm going to give us one that's a little bit harder because you'll have some, I think they're on the back side of the worksheet, where the part of the graph they show you that they want you to write the equation for is not starting at 0. Okay. So I've got an image here. And if I didn't have that blue box on there, you know, most people, if I ask, like, what graph do you see? If you started over here at 0, 1, most people would say sine, mountain high, valley low. Okay, but I'm going to force you to shift the graph, okay, on this one, and write the equation for the frame I have identified. So what graph is in that frame I have marked? Another cosine with a positive A again. Okay, I should have mixed it up, but I didn't. I'm sorry. What's the starting point? Pi over 4, comma 1. Okay, so again, be really careful with starting point. Remember that if it's a cosine graph, I'm not asking about a starting point of the graph. I want the starting point for the frame because that's what we identify as C over B comma D when we're graphing. So my starting point is at pi over 4 comma 1. What's my amplitude? Well, my height is 2, but the amplitude is only half of the vertical height, right? It's like, where do you go from that starting point up and down? Well, I only went up 1 and down 1, so the amplitude is 1. Be careful and remember, amplitude's definition is half the distance from the min to the max. It's not your full height of your wave. And what's the period? Is it pi? Yes. What's one way you could calculate period if you're unsure? Yep. Just that difference between the start and the stop of the frame. So if it's all the way out at 5 pi over 4 and it started at pi over 4, what's the difference between those two values? Because that's just horizontal distance. And that's 4 pi over 4, which is 4. So if you're ever unsure, just do a calculation. I mean, I said 4, but I wrote pi. Sorry. Okay, so my period is pi. Okay, now I want you to talk with your pods for a little bit and see if you can come up with your A, B, C, and D values. I will say my warning to you is that C over B, right? Okay, so be thoughtful about that. Go for it.
So we have B as well.
Yeah.
D Y coordinate is not the starting point.
Starting point.
So the period is pi. Yeah.
Yeah. Which means B is 2. And then we want to find C over B, finding the C. C over B is what? Pi over 4, right? That's where we start. Pi over 4. C over B, which is 2. The X value is pi over 2. A 2. Yeah,
Because the period is always 2 pi over B, and then the period equals B, so, or, the period equals pi, so pi equals 2 pi over B. Yes. You said equals pi over 2. Well, I just thought about it like,
just means in the
what,
parentheses, 2x minus
2 pi divided by what is pi? Yeah. do you want me to? So that makes.
I'll give it to you when I give it back to everybody else, and you'll just have it like a homework assignment. Okay. This is Ms. Cronky. Hi. No, he left earlier.
Oh, what I did? Okay, so C over B.
Oh,
You know,
yeah,
is
no,
the-
he had his blue slip,
X
so I assumed
coordinate
he was going to sign out.
And the
I don't know where he is.
So I did C over 2 equals pi over 4.
Okay, let's come together and see. All right, now, one thing you can do is if you work in alphabetical order, it'll always work out. So if you start with A, then you're looking at the amplitude and the shape of the graph. Since we said it was positive cosine and amplitude is 1, then A is equal to 1. Alphabetically, your next letter or parameter should be B. So you can always find B with the period. Okay. Now remember, you would calculate the period by doing 2 pi divided by B. One way for you to figure out what B is just think about it. 2 pi divided by what is equal to pi? 2. Therefore, B has to be 2. That's probably the easiest way. If you're unsure, set it equal to pi. And that's really like pi over 1, and you can cross multiply, and you'll come up with B equals 2. Okay, so you can do that if necessary. And then alphabetically, now that you have B, you're allowed to find C. So most incorrect answer would be to say C is pi and B is 4 just by looking at numerator and denominator. You have to think about it like that's C over B, but we know that B for this graph must be 2. That's equal to pi over 4. What's a good way to solve for C? Cross multiply. Now some of you might be able to look at that and say, oh, if I'm dividing it in half, it's got to be pi halves, because then that would be pi fourths. But if you're at all confused about fractions, again, cross multiply. That's 4c equals 2 pi. Divide by 4, therefore c equals pi over 2. And of course, d is equal to 1. Okay. So then when I write my equation, I would say something like y equals 1 times cosine of bx, that would be 2x. Will it be minus pi halves or plus pi halves? Minus the c, which is positive, so then it will look like a negative, and then a plus 1. And that's what you'll be doing on your homework. When you get your homework, you'll be able to see, like, there's only one frame shown, so that's the frame that they want you to write the equation. So we really, on this homework, should all come up with the same answer. Okay, Monday is our last set of notes. Tuesday and Wednesday are review. Thursday and Friday are your tests. Yeah. Are they in my class?
No, they're in yeah. You want me to go to?
No, I think I have one extra usually, so you can take one.